Okay, well, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Tom Inui, truly one of the great scholars and leaders in American medicine and healthcare education. Uh, I first became aware of Tom late 70s, early 80s. He was among the leadership of the Society of General Internal Medicine, which was just founded, I guess, in 79 or 80. And whenever Tom got up to speak, I was wowed, actually, by his thoughtfulness and eloquence. If I had to say Tom specialized in something, it would be in thoughtfulness and eloquence. Uh, he's he's been a uh-oh, I set the bar a little high here. I'm sorry. He's been a leader in the field of primary care internal medicine and was president of the Society of General Internal Medicine in 1987. And I've been privileged to get to know him a little bit and work with him occasionally through the years. Tom graduated. I'll just go through a little bit of your history. Tom graduated from Haverford College, majoring in philosophy. He went to medical school and residency at Johns Hopkins, stayed as an internal medicine resident through his chief residency and was a junior faculty member. He was at Hopkins for about 15 years. During his residency, he also did a research externship in Calcutta, India, was a Carnegie Commonwealth clinical scholar and achieved a master's in public health in 1973. He moved to the University of Washington in 1980. And by 1992 was a professor of medicine and public health. He was also the director for about 15 years of the RWJ Clinical Scholars Program at the University of Washington and mentored many fellows who would go on to have distinguished careers in their own rights. In 1992, he was recruited to become the professor and founding chair in the Department of Ambulatory Care and Prevention and the director of the Division of Primary Care at Harvard, Harvard Medical School, and was later named Cabot Professor of Ambulatory Care and Prevention at Harvard Medical School. In 1998 to 2002, he was a Fetzer Institute Senior Scholar and was president of and CEO of Fetzer in 2001. Indiana University recruited him in 2002, where he became the Sam Registry Chair in Health Services Research, and later the Joe and Ellen Mamlin Professor of Global Health Research. So he spent his career, the rest of his academic career, although it's not nearly over, at Indiana University School of Medicine. A few years ago, he became an emeritus professor. Tom has been a consummate collaborator, co-authoring over 250 articles, many of them first authored in high impact journals, focusing on the effectiveness of primary care health services, doctor-patient communication, health-related behaviors, chronic disease management, educational effectiveness, humanism in medicine. I think, and it was fun going through his CV, although I had read many of his articles. It was fun seeing all of the leaders in healthcare and medical education that he collaborated with. He's had an enormous impact. His scholarly contributions, I think, have been incredibly diverse, but always informed by an appreciation of the importance of the biopsychosocial model, relationship-centered healthcare, and a public health perspective. He and his colleagues have made a number of important contributions to the understanding of physician-patient interactions as they affect the outcomes of care. He's had many visiting professorships in the US and abroad, more awards than I can mention, but perhaps most importantly for our fireside chat this afternoon, he's been a pioneer in developing and articulating the field of healthcare professionalism. His white paper, A Flag in the Wind, written during a residency with the AAMC in 2002 to 2003, is one of our profession's foundational documents. And personally, when I read his paper, he published with Michael Rabo, Rachel Remmen, and Dean Parmalee, a paper on professional formation in 2010. And that was actually a critical paper for me in understanding how I might move forward and contribute to this emerging discipline. I could take up the entire time just talking about Dr. Inui's many contributions, but I want to get on with this. So Tom, thanks so much for being here. I've been in a couple of breakout sessions where I saw you were participating, and I saw that you were here pretty much most of I think for the entire afternoon. I wondered if you had some impressions or comments on the presentations you saw.
Yes, thanks for abridging the introduction a little bit, preserving time for us to chat. Yes, it's been a good day, hasn't it? This is the first meeting of the organization that I've joined. Though I've been a member for a couple of years, I haven't been in one of the national meetings. And I took note as the day went along, and I could only go to some of the sessions, so I apologize to those of you who made contributions I didn't catch during the day. I did catch sight and heard a number of themes that are familiar to me. One might be from the opening plenary session, in which it was observed that we all live in the construct of our personal and social histories, and that's certainly true of me and my family history. You could ask about that if you wanted to. A second note that was struck that I greatly appreciated was the emphasis on formation. My AAMC monograph, A Flag in the Wind, I think in many respects introduced to the medical education enterprise the central notion of education as formation in professional fields. And that's now become a conventional thing to observe, but in its day, I had borrowed that notion from Parker Palmer, who in turn had borrowed it from seminary preparation. But I think you as an organization continue to work that notion and make it come alive in your educational programs. I really applauded that. I noticed the emphasis on relationships as central to all of the enterprises within which the organizations within which we work. I was pleased to see that, and tried with Richard Frankel and others to make our own contribution to the notion that relationships were central to healthcare longer ago than I would like to remember in public, but we made a very complex observation, so it's hard to digest, but we decided that we should talk about relationships to patients, that comes easily to mind, to other healthcare providers, the teams, to others who work in healthcare organizations, relationships to community, which I applauded reference to in one of your breakout sessions. And maybe the most difficult of all, relationship to self and understanding of self was one of the axes of relationship that we were interested in. Finally, I was very glad that Dr. Sinsky mentioned appreciative inquiry, which is a method born in the business community and brought over into organizational development more broadly. We've used, Rich Frankel and I and Deb Roeder have used appreciative inquiry extensively. And I know they have at UVA and elsewhere as an organizational development approach to deepen the expression of professional values and illuminate the existence of professional exemplary behaviors inside organizations. And we all believe that the students, the residents, and the rest of us in the Academic Health Center learn more from the expression of behaviors that are rooted in professional values than from any other source of learning. So those were my notes from the day, a very good day. And I enjoyed very much every session I was in.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, well, you invited me to ask about your family history, and I think people would be interested in knowing how that informed your sense of what professionalism and professional development, personal development is all about.
Well, yeah, thank you. Let me, people should know we haven't rehearsed this at all.
Not at all, no.
So this is on the fly. I really hope that Dr. Resnick is present for this one, because he opened the door in this way for us all. So where to begin? My mother used to say that she was in a mixed marriage. She meant by that in 1942, so during World War II, she met my father, who was a full-blooded Japanese American and a surgical resident at Johns Hopkins. She was a nurse, German English extraction. He was from the West Coast. She was from Illinois. She was a farm girl from Illinois. And they married after a relatively brief romance, but at a difficult time for two people like them to marry. They couldn't they couldn't travel to get the approval of their families because of the restrictions on travel and their jobs at Hopkins. But the farm girl that she is, she said that they didn't know, she wrote this in a letter I've seen, whose society any children they might have could join and become members. My father's family at the time was interned in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. They had all lived in Los Angeles, so they were rounded up and put in the so-called relocation. Some people now use the language other than relocation, but relocation camps in Heart Mountain. Her family was still working the farms. She said that she hoped that if they were fortunate enough to have children, that they would be loved by both families, and that we might express hybrid vigor, that's farm talk, for better corn crops, approaches to better corn crops. So I grew up in a multicultural household. My father's family was Buddhist. When my grandfather lived in our house years later, the ashes of the ancestors were in the corner. Mother was a Unitarian, social activist, president of the YMCA board, and desegregated the Ys in Youngstown, Ohio. An amazing achievement where black people were simply not welcome to swim or send their kids to swim. We had a black foster child who was a member of our family for a year from Youngstown, because she felt we should lend a hand and open a home to this kid who was struggling. It was an exciting year. He was a pyromaniac. So we all had to sort of keep an eye out for little fires that might pop up and whether the matches could all be secured. But he was a good kid, and he straightened up and flew right later. And we were really pleased when David made it to a community college. She became a coordinator for AFS, that's a field service exchange program. One of my sisters spent a year in France. Another sister spent a year in Denmark, Aarhus, and I had a German brother from northern Germany. So she was a globalist as well as a person committed to diversity and to social action. In some ways, I've then become aware of the centrality not only of diversity and importance of pulling together on a community basis, but also stresses and strains in medicine. In 1965, when Congress passed Medicare and Medicaid, my father, who was chief of surgery for the Youngstown Public Hospitals, was voted out of the local medical society because he spoke up in support of the passage of Medicare and Medicaid, and he was expelled for his public support of what was called, and this will sound familiar, socialist medicine was the accusation. He didn't leave the society, they threw him out. That was confusing to me. I had decided to go to medical school and was on my way to Hopkins, but it was not clear to me at that time what social medicine and organized medicine was all about. At Hopkins, I was introduced to the institution by an orderly, the man who stocked the linen carts in the emergency room, went by the name of Lucky. And Lucky introduced me to the other Hopkins. He showed me through the hospital, and I remember pausing after going around the statue of Jesus where he said, "What do you see?" So I thought this was the first quiz I was getting in medical school. "What do you see?" he said, "Right here." And I said, "Well, I see 4 doors and 2 drinking fountains." And he said, "Well, what are the doors?" And I said, "Well, 2 of them are bathrooms. There's the men's room and the women's room because they're labeled. But the other doors, I have no idea. They seem to be closed." He said, "Well, those are the Black people's bathrooms, which just recently have been closed. And those 2 drinking fountains, one was labeled white and the other one was labeled colored. Now they're both available. Let's go down to the pathology," he said. And he took me down to pathology and introduced me to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown showed me that there were 2 refrigerators, one for white people's bodies and the other for Black people's bodies. They hadn't really yet changed fully the morgue. And he showed me the buckets of organs, one for Black people's autopsy organs and the other one for white people's autopsy organs. And then my godmother sent me out to the neighborhoods to see people in their houses. The activity that I was part of were new baby visits in the Hopkins neighborhood, which is the East Baltimore, largely Black neighborhood. So I was able to see how the visiting nurses would spread out newspapers in those houses to make a kind of a clean space to examine the babies, because otherwise they were so rough and uncleanable that it was hard to know where to do that exam. Then in medical school, and I'll do this and then stop, in 1968, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, I saw the National Guard gather around the institutions and put a ring around Hopkins to keep the neighborhoods out. I was living in a dorm at that point. I was a junior. And they told us to turn off our living room lights so we wouldn't draw fire. The residents moved out of the so-called compound, which was resident housing, and joined us in our suite. They camped out a bunch of them camped out on our living room floor, and I looked out and could see Baltimore burning. At night, I'm sorry. I'll recover. And then convinced the young woman I loved that we should live in the neighborhood, not in the compound, not in Hopkins housing, not in the suburb, but one block behind Hopkins Hospital. So that began the career then in which I, at every turn, tried to work for the underserved. At every turn where possible, tried to live where they lived or spend major time where they lived, and where I did my small part for working in the vineyard of the determinants of health. That's the explanation for the public health degree that Dennis alluded to. He did a good job with the curriculum vitae, except he didn't mention the 2 years I worked as a volunteer for the Indian Health Service in New Mexico, which was my first job out after the Hopkins residency. So we do live, don't we, in the present, informed by the past and by the history that we have. Co-created, I like that terminology, by the people we serve and the people we work with in the organizations that we hope also serve.
Well, Tom, thanks. Thanks for all that. You know, we all live in the presence of history. Salim early said we're prisoners of history. You know, what I'm experiencing is, I'm sure you read the Into the Water paper years ago. That started off with the vignette with the older fish saying to the younger fish, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the younger fish said, "What's water?" Right? And you know, my experience today is that many of our trainees and many of our faculty don't know they're in the water, you know, because it's all around them. And you know, what's been uncovered in recent years with our racial reckoning and a greater awareness of the lived experiences of Black and brown and marginalized people in general, oppressed people, and yet it often doesn't make it into the mainstream. And you've done a tremendous amount. I mean, you were really ahead of the curve. In 2003, you were on a Institute of Medicine committee that produced the unequal treatment report. You know, that was an amazing and eloquent document that has been cited many thousands of times and hopefully has moved the needle. But I wonder what you think is next. I mean, how can we as a society, you know, where should we go in both education and research to really appreciate the individual humanity of all of our patients, free of bias and assumptions. Like, how do we get there? Do you have some sense of where you would go or what you would recommend?
Well, let me say that I was right with the question until you got to free of bias. I'm not sure.
It's possible
that I, for one, could say that I could be a participant or an observer who was ever free of bias. I do think that it's possible to be so transparent that the biases are revealed, and you can engage in dialogue with others who also have their lenses through which they are seeing their circumstances and their work and the meaning of their work. I have made a habit, I just did it right in front of you, of being willing to talk about and write about just about anything that's happened to me. That's not because I've lived a perfect life or a great life or an exemplary life. It's because I only understand one life deeply, and that's my own. And if it would be possible by opening up to stimulate others to open up and be in communication with one another. That's, I think, the best shot we have at moving our communities of action. Those are the academic health centers and the other healthcare delivery organizations within which we work forward in this area. And we're discovering, I think, that the students, I will say I've discovered that the students know an amazing amount about the water. We used to, there's a whole string of publications that largely can find Richard Frankel has been an author of. We discovered that if we ask students to keep a journal online that only they would read and the course director would read, of experiences that they'd had that taught them something about professionalism or professional values, that they would write and that they would describe incidents in their lived experience that were totally worth talking about. And that if we gathered them and sat in a small group and said, okay, in front of you are the journal entries that we've anonymized, but that you either wrote or your classmates wrote, who has one in front of them they'd like to talk about? That they were very able, with a proper facilitator, to keeping everybody safe, to talk about these experiences. And they knew a lot about how professional values are expressed inside their environments. And a thrilling aspect of this work was about 2/3 of them were reported experiences that you would read and say, oh, I'm so glad that happened. They were positive ones. About 1/3 were, you'd read them, sort of a read and weep exercise. Yeah. And the students would choose some positive, but also choose the really negative ones, as the gnarly ones, I used to call them, to talk about. And they became, in a certain way, an engine of environmental exploration. They talked about the water. And earlier on in the day, there were really good comments about how difficult it is in, let's say, a gnarly experience for students to say anything, because they're in such a hierarchical environment. So in the small group, we would actually practice what could be said. I would say, okay, so we all get this. Suppose you were in this experience and you wanted to say something, and a few heads would nod. What would you say? I would say, right here, right now. Let's just make it up. You take a breath. You start exhaling. Your vocal cords move. Your lips move. Your tongue moves. And you say, and I would point to one of them, and she or he would try something.
Yeah.
And I said, I'd always say, well, that's great, good start. Who else has something that they could say? And then we'd sort of go around a little bit. It's like Beth's difficult conversations. It's a good way to spread, to reveal the expertise in the group, right? And then to tell them. What I used to usually end up saying to them is, sound like a student. Because you're not going to get nailed for sounding like a student. So if you've just heard a microaggression or micro-discrimination, a disparagement of somebody who didn't deserve it, don't say that. Don't say it to your attending physician. Wow, you really did something I wouldn't have done back there, because that might cost you. But think about this, I would say to the students. You come out of the room, they're debriefing, it's still morning rounds, so you don't know when to get this in. But before morning rounds ends, you say, doctor, I was really confused with what happened with Mr. Wilson back there. You said, and then you replay the tape. And I didn't know why you said that. Could you just explain to me, help me with this confusion? Then you'll sound like a student. And what is Wilson gonna do? If you sound like a student, that might not be an easy answer for him, but at least it'll be a chance to discuss whether you should ever call somebody whatever it was, that he had called them. Anyhow, I feel like we can learn more from students as guides. I feel as though we can more and more try to actually reveal the water. And that's why I like appreciative inquiry, because it reveals the positive stuff that happens. And you don't even have to ask about the negative stuff. The negative stuff is always the flip side of the positive stuff. It's there for the taking. You just say, I didn't have to ask for barriers. I can tell by the great stories what the usual is. The usual has barriers, and they were overcome in these great stories. And I like asking those with fresh eyes, who are the students. And I like asking everybody in the circle who is a team member. I think when we get to that, our educational innovation will continue to sparkle.
Yeah, and when you do those groups, students support each other and learn and grow from each other. So that's another, great aspect of it. I wish we could, talk all afternoon, but we're supposed to end at I think 5:15. And I wanted to get some other voices in here if possible. I know there's some folks that Bill Branch, you've worked with, who's done some amazing, he's been an amazing leader in humanism in medical education. Fred Hafferty is here. William Agbor Bailly, who had just joined our board, you've worked with. I don't know if you've worked with David Dukas. David was one of the founders of our organization. And
I met with Tom, particularly when I was at the University of Michigan. I actually have a different take on how to talk to students when they have a troublesome issue in professionalism. I use the ploy of saying, whatever you do, do not make declarative statements of that was wrong or something like that. When you threw that hemostat, that was wrong. Instead, I'll say, invoke the Jeopardy rule. And they'll go, what do you mean? I said, put everything that you say in the form of a question. Ask as opposed to tell. Ask. I'm a little, like you said, I'm a little confused. I always will lead with, I'm a little unclear. Can you explain to me why? So that way they have a chance to back down from what could have been an extraordinarily aggressive semantic outburst that they didn't mean. And they may say, if they have humility and courage, to say, God, I really got ticked off about X, Y, and Z, or I had this other thing that I was thinking about, etc., so that they have a chance to explain, not necessarily to defend, but at least that there be an interchange so that there's a bridging of the communication. And sometimes you'll have people who will say, no, I don't apologize at all for this because I was really PO'd about X, Y, Z. And that's a different issue because that's why we have a professionalism council for circumstances like that.
Very similar approach, David.
Thanks, David.
I have to get in here before this ends to say hello to Tom. Tom, it's been a long time since I've seen you. Yeah. And you may not know this, but you were kind of a mentor to me, probably to everybody you've come across. But when we did the research project where I was the PI of the project, but Tom was kind of the super PI, and he kind of taught me and helped me along the whole way with our project. But the working with the students and listening to their stories is something we shared in common. And I would just say that from my point of view, what I got from that, from about 7 years of doing that with students at Harvard, was the immense empathy the students had for the patients. It was far beyond what we had. We didn't realize how much we lost along the way. And in a way, it sort of woke us back up again, made us understand a little bit more about what we should be feeling for these suffering people.
Could I just say amen? And the students' observation and willingness to write is a very powerful instrument. I remember one of our journal entries at IU. This was one focused on this is a junior year, so third-year student goes to HIV clinic, and she is exposed in the workroom to a bunch of homophobic jokes, where the jokes are being led by the attending.
Yeah,
and she and everybody's laughing, and she says to herself, "This is her journal entry." I say to myself, "What am I going to do if I don't laugh? I'm going to be seen as disapproving, and I'll get a bad grade, and so on." So she said, I sort of choked and maybe sounded like I was laughing a little bit. That was Tuesday, she writes. On Thursday, I go back to clinic, and the attending says to me, "Excuse me, I'll bet you've already written in your journal about those jokes I was telling on Tuesday. Can we talk about this?" And they have a discussion in the clinic doctor's workroom about what they were doing and how they're all sort of shamed by the situation that they participated in. So the students become kind of a intervention potential, not only driven by a single student, but by awaking to the presence of learners as we do things.
Well, What a turnaround.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Bill, for joining in. I think in the interest of maybe my introduction, Tom, was too long because we don't have that much more time. We only have a couple more minutes, and I wanted to just express my thanks for being with us and for showing us what a rich and satisfying experience it can be to work with students around professionalism issues. I think, I was particularly moved and inspired by your story of your own origins.
Dennis, may I just say, Jerry has invited me, Jerry Stapleton, to join him in the gathering after the close of the meeting. So I'll do that.
Oh, terrific.
Somebody's sitting there with something they'd like to say.
Yes, I had planned on opening it up to everybody to chat. So if you can stick with us for a little while, that would be great.
Sure.
And let me also say, I see that Beth Ryder put the link to Flag in the Wind in the chat. And if you haven't read that, I would highly recommend that you get to that. It's an amazing document. And also, you might want to, if you go to the National Academy of Medicine website, you can download Unequal Treatment. It was written in 2003, but it's more relevant than ever now. And Dr. Inui is also interviewed in one of our podcast series. So in case you all don't know, we have produced the APHC and the PFO, professionalformation.org, has sponsored podcast and professionalism. And Dr. Inui was interviewed about a year ago. So wherever you get your podcast, you can look for healthcare professionalism, education, research, and resources. And this is a terrific series of podcasts, and I think you'll enjoy the interview with Tom.